I stared at my half-finished plate as my own son shoved it away with a sneer. "You've eaten enough, old lady." The roast chicken still steamed, but I felt ice in my veins. Claire smirked behind her wine glass. This was their house now, their table. And I was just the aging inconvenience they were too polite to kick out. But they didn't know. I'd already rewritten everything. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The roast chicken smelled of rosemary and garlic, but Helen barely noticed. She sat stiff-backed at the end of her son's gleaming quartz dining table, careful not to scuff the white linen napkin folded across her lap. Crystal glasses caught the overhead light, and Claire's charcuterie board looked like it belonged in a magazine. Everything gleamed, except the people. Helen's fork hovered over her plate, carving off a modest piece of chicken breast. She chewed slowly, grateful for the flavor and warmth. Across from her, Mark poured himself a third glass of Cabernet, the corners of his mouth already slackening. Claire scrolled casually through her phone, tapping the screen like Helen wasn't even there. A polite silence stretched too long. Helen tried to fill it. "This stuffing," she said softly, "reminds me of the kind we used to make with Nana, remember? On Pine Street." Mark didn't look up. "We don't use boxed crap anymore." Claire snorted under her breath. Helen nodded, quietly placing her fork down. Her plate was only half finished, but she was pacing herself. Too much salt gave her ankles hell the next morning, and she'd already had her daily meds. Mark leaned over suddenly. With one swift motion, he shoved Helen's plate away from her, the scrape of ceramic on wood sharp and jarring. "You've eaten enough, old lady," he muttered. For a second, the whole room froze. Claire lifted her wineglass and took a slow sip, not meeting Helen's eyes. The corners of her lip curled upward in a smirk she didn't bother to hide. Helen's spine went rigid. The words hung in the air, stinging more than if he'd slapped her. She looked down at her hands, wrinkled, veined, trembling slightly. She hadn't realized they were shaking until now. "I'm not full," she said, her voice quiet but even. Mark scoffed. "It's called portion control. You always overdo it." Helen's eyes snapped to him. "Since when is it your job to manage what I eat?" Claire set her glass down a bit too forcefully. "Let's not start this again. It's been a long week for everyone." Helen turned toward her. "Start what, Claire?" Claire's eyes flicked to Mark, then back. "You know what I mean." The room shrank. The chairs felt farther away, the lights colder. Helen reached slowly for her plate, pulling it back toward her with measured grace. She picked up her fork again, even as her heart thudded in her chest. She would not let her hand tremble. She would not give them that. But when she glanced up, Mark was watching her with that same look she'd seen when he was 12, and just realized he could hurt her with silence. He hadn't grown out of it. "So," he said, fake cheer in his voice, "any updates on the estate stuff? Did you end up filing those transfer papers?" Claire perked up suddenly, setting her napkin on her lap like a stage cue. "We were just talking about the house the other day. I mean, it would make a great investment property when it's time, right?" Helen didn't answer. She stared at the browned edge of her stuffing, appetite long gone. "I just think," Claire added, "it would be nice to keep it in the family, for the grandkids." Helen set down her fork, the clink loud in the room. Her hands were no longer trembling. She folded her napkin with care, smoothing its edges with her fingertips, her eyes never leaving her son. Then, quietly, almost gently, "You two talk like I've already died." Mark rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Mom. Don't be dramatic." Claire laughed nervously. "He didn't mean it like that." "No?" Helen's voice hardened. "Then how did he mean, 'You've eaten enough, old lady'?" Mark opened his mouth, but no words came. Claire reached for her glass again, suddenly fascinated by her manicure. Helen stood slowly, adjusting her cardigan. "No dessert for me tonight," she said, her voice calm but clipped. "I've lost my appetite." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair, her fingers brushing the soft wool. It used to be her favorite shade of teal. Now it felt like armor. As she stepped toward the hallway, she turned one last time. The chandelier above them flickered as the furnace kicked on. I'll see myself out. Then, with measured steps and her chin high, Helen walked out the front door into the cold Minnesota night. Snow hissed softly under Helen's boots as she stepped into Maple and Ash Cafe, the warm air fogging her glasses instantly. The scent of fresh cinnamon rolls and dark roast coffee wrapped around her like a blanket. She didn't take off her coat. Ruth looked up from behind the counter, eyes narrowing at once. "You're early," she said, setting down the tin of biscotti she'd been arranging, "and you look like you didn't sleep." Helen slid onto a bar stool at the far end, her usual spot. "Didn't," she muttered. Ruth turned away without another word and began making Helen's usual black coffee, splash of oat milk, 2 sugars. When she placed the mug down, she paused. "You're shaking." Helen looked down. Her fingers, still in wool gloves, trembled lightly against the ceramic. She tried to laugh it off. "It's cold." "It's not just cold," Ruth said flatly. Helen sipped anyway. The heat scalded the tip of her tongue, grounding her for a second. "He pushed my plate away," she said, her voice catching. "At dinner, like I was a child. Said I'd eaten enough." Ruth stared, unmoving. "He what?" "Said," Helen inhaled shakily, "said I'd eaten enough. Called me an old lady. Right there at the table." For a moment the cafe was still. Just the low hum of the espresso machine and the murmur of a college kid on his laptop in the corner. Then Ruth slapped the counter so hard that the biscotti jar rattled. "That's abuse, Helen. That's not family." Helen flinched, her shoulders tensed like she'd done something wrong. "I shouldn't have brought it up. It's not, look, it's just Mark being Mark. He doesn't mean—" "Don't you dare excuse that," Ruth snapped. "He's a grown man treating his mother like garbage at his own dinner table." Helen's eyes shimmered with something between guilt and exhaustion. "I raised him. What does that say about me?" "That you loved him more than he deserved," Ruth said, softening. She came around the counter and sat next to her, folding her hands on the counter like a witness giving testimony. Helen stared at the mug in front of her. Claire was smiling, not even pretending to be civil, like I was some burden they were too polite to kick to the curb. Ruth gave a sharp snort. "That woman couldn't spell decency if you spotted her the D and the E." Helen managed a weak chuckle, but her eyes remained distant. Ruth leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Let me ask you something, Hel. If a friend told you her son humiliated her in front of his wife, pushed her plate away like she was a dog, would you tell her to suck it up and smile through dessert?" Helen hesitated. "No." "Exactly. So why are you treating yourself worse than you'd treat a stranger?" Helen blinked. That landed harder than she expected. Ruth kept going, gentler now. "You gave him everything. And if this is what he's become, then maybe he doesn't deserve what's left." Silence hung between them. Ruth didn't push. Helen needed the space to let the words settle. After a while, Helen reached for her coffee again. Her hands had steadied. "You know," she said quietly, "when I walked out last night, I wasn't angry. I was hollow. Like something had cracked open and nothing came out." "That's not hollow," Ruth said. "That's freedom trying to find its way in." Helen turned her head, eyebrows lifted. "Poet now?" "Always been," Ruth smiled, "just hidden behind coffee grounds and sarcasm." Helen looked down, tapping her nail gently on the ceramic rim of her mug. "I don't want to die and have him own the ending." Ruth's expression turned fierce, her voice low and steady. "Then don't let him write it." The office was quieter than she expected. No ringing phones, no secretaries typing away. Just the soft tick of a grandfather clock and the scent of old wood polish clinging to the paneled walls. Helen stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if she should knock, even though the door was already open. "Mrs. Ward?" a calm voice called from inside. "Come in." Thomas Blake rose from behind a mahogany desk that looked older than both of them put together. His salt and pepper hair was combed back neatly, and his tie had a chessboard pattern that made Helen think he probably liked to win without raising his voice. "Please," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from him, "take your time." Helen sat slowly, pulling a folded manila envelope from her purse. She placed it on the desk like it weighed 50 pounds. "My will, the original one." Thomas opened it gently, scanning the typed lines with careful eyes. He flipped to the last page, then looked up. "You've left everything to your son." Helen nodded once. "That was before." Thomas didn't pry. "Do you want to discuss alternatives, or have you already made your decision?" Her voice was steady. "Erase his name." There was a beat of silence. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what happened. He just nodded, once with the clean precision of a man used to dealing with irreversible decisions, and turned to a legal pad beside him. "I'll draft a full revocation, then we can begin the new trust. Are you thinking of a charitable beneficiary?" "Yes," she said. "The community library, the one on Hennepin, the one with the reading program for foster kids." Thomas's pen didn't pause. "Excellent choice. They've had budget cuts the last 2 years." Helen watched his hands work. There was something oddly soothing about the scratch of pen on paper, the methodical way he turned each page in his binder before moving on. Her breathing slowed. "Will this hold up?" she asked finally. "If you follow through and sign the trust in full, yes. Your son has no automatic claim. People assume blood makes things permanent. It doesn't." He looked up, eyes sharp but not unkind. "This office specializes in, well, let's just say we make clean exits." Helen allowed herself the ghost of a smile. "I've always cleaned up my own messes." "You're not the mess," he replied. She looked away, suddenly blinking back heat behind her eyes. "You don't know him." "I don't have to," Thomas said gently. "People don't come here until they've already made peace with the pain. What they want is control." Helen breathed in deeply, nodding. Thomas pushed a new document toward her, crisp and freshly typed. "Review this, then we'll get your signature notarized." She took the pen with a steady hand. Her eyes scanned the lines slowly, absorbing each word like it was a stone she was setting in place to build something stronger. Her name, Mark Ward's name, struck through, the name of the library centered in black ink underlined. She signed. The click of the pen sounded louder than it should have in the silent office. Thomas stood and walked the papers to a small cabinet, locking them inside. "It's done." Helen exhaled, not a sigh, not quite relief, something deeper, like shedding skin. "I didn't think it'd be that easy," she murmured. "It's never easy," Thomas said. "It's just right." Helen sat by the window in Thomas's office as the morning light poured through tall, slatted blinds, streaking across the contract laid out in front of her like a path. She could hear the rhythmic ticking of the same grandfather clock from before, but today it didn't feel intimidating. It felt like punctuation, like something was being closed, sentence by sentence. Thomas, meticulous as ever, flipped through a freshly printed stack of documents. "We've included revocation language that invalidates all previous wills," he said without looking up. "And we've structured the library grant through an irrevocable trust. Mark won't be able to touch a cent." Helen nodded. She had slept the night before, finally, and it showed. The shadows under her eyes had lessened. Her cardigan was pressed. Her lipstick, while subtle, was fresh. "I want the library's youth program protected," she said. "No loopholes. No handoffs to some future city budget committee." Thomas smiled faintly. "Already done. It's a restricted endowment. That money will keep those kids reading long after we're both gone." Helen breathed in through her nose, one hand resting over the other on the edge of the table. Her fingers didn't tremble this time. "Good." He passed her the final document, turning it gently to face her. "Sign here, then again at the bottom, and one last time on the acknowledgement page." She picked up the pen, weighty and brass. Her signature flowed in deliberate strokes, measured, firm, without hesitation. Each letter felt like a chisel strike against the version of her life she was leaving behind. When she was finished, Thomas collected the papers and tucked them into a pristine folder embossed with his firm's name. "Next stop's the county records office. You'll want it on file officially." "Do I need to bring anything?" "Just the folder," he said, standing. "And your conviction." The county records office wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either, just institutional. Gray tile, fluorescent lighting, rows of chairs no one wanted to sit in. Helen stepped up to the clerk's counter with the folder pressed firmly under one arm. "Can I help you?" the young woman asked without glancing up from her screen. I have a revised trust that needs recording. Helen Ward. That got her attention. Emily Tran looked up, glasses slipping a little down her nose. Her face softened. Of course, Ms. Ward. I can take care of that personally. Helen handed her the folder and Emily opened it with practiced efficiency, fingers moving swiftly across the pages. Attorney Blake does good work, very clean. I'll scan and certify them, then stamp them into the public record. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. Helen stood there while Emily worked, the scanner beeping softly with each page that slid through. She studied the seal on the wall. Hennepin County, Clerk of Records. The words felt heavy with finality and, strangely, peace. After a final beep and a click of a lever, Emily pressed a red stamp into the top page. Then another, then another. Thunk, thunk, thunk. She slid the stamped originals back into the folder and handed them over with a respectful nod. You're all set. You've made your decisions permanent. Helen let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere below her ribs. Good. Ruth didn't wait for her to get to the counter when Helen returned to Maple and Ash that afternoon. She caught sight of the folder tucked under her arm and broke into a grin so wide it made the teen barista do a double take. Helen held it up like a trophy. Stamped and recorded. Ruth let out a small whoop and thumped her hand on the counter. Hot damn, that's my girl. I thought I'd feel guilty, Helen admitted, sliding onto her usual stool. But I don't. Not even a little. You know why? Ruth leaned in, lowering her voice. Because this isn't revenge. This is justice. Helen smiled into her coffee. For the first time in days, it tasted sweet. The wineglass was already full when Helen arrived. Cabernet, your favorite, Mark said, his grin too wide to be sincere as he ushered her into the dining room. The house was spotless. Again, not lived in clean, but curated, like a showroom. Claire's signature, nothing out of place, not even affection. Helen hung her coat on the same hook by the door, slow and deliberate. She didn't smile back. Thanks, she said, her voice smooth as glass. Mark guided her to her seat at the end of the long table. Pot roast steamed in the center, surrounded by bowls of buttery mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, and Claire's ever-present kale salad that no one seemed to actually eat. You've outdone yourselves, Helen said, placing her napkin on her lap. Claire gave a light laugh as she set down the bread basket. We try to keep things special when family's over. Helen glanced up. I'm sure. The wine was rich, velvety, almost too sweet. Helen took one sip and set it aside. Mark pulled out his phone, pretending to check a message, then slid it away with a casual flick of his thumb. So, he said, spooning gravy over his roast. Any updates on the estate stuff? I remember you said you were going to file some papers. Helen sliced a small piece of meat and placed it in her mouth, chewing thoughtfully. I did. Mark looked up. Oh yeah? Helen nodded. All filed. Claire leaned in slightly. Well, that's good. It'll be such a relief to know things are squared away. I'm sure it will, Helen said, reaching for the carrots. She moved with unhurried grace, like time obeyed her now, not the other way around. Mark chuckled, playing with his fork. Guess we can finally stop nagging you about writing a real will, huh? Helen didn't respond. Claire took over. And it'll be good to know the house stays in the family, too. The kids always loved visiting. So many memories there. Helen tilted her head, as if genuinely considering the statement. She said. Memories. Mark raised his glass in a faux toast. Here's to keeping things where they belong. Helen set down her fork gently, the silver edge barely making a sound against the plate. She looked at Mark, then Claire, then back to Mark. Her tone was so quiet, so even, it took them both a moment to realize what she'd said. You're not in it anymore. Mark blinked. What? Claire froze, her wineglass hovering inches from her lips. I said, Helen repeated, her voice unshakable, you're not in the will anymore. Either of you. The silence that followed was glacial. Mark's smile faltered. Mom, what are you talking about? Helen reached into her purse and slid a folded paper envelope across the table. The firm's name, Blake and Levitt, Estate Counsel, was printed in clean black letters. Mark didn't touch it. Claire narrowed her eyes. "You're joking." Helen folded her hands in her lap. "Number, the house, the savings, the Roth IRA, even the family jewelry, every bit of it is gone from your reach." "You're giving it to some stranger?" Mark snapped. "No," Helen said, her voice hardening. "To children who never told me I'd had enough. To readers who still see value in what I have left to give." Mark's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You can't do that." "I already did." Claire's wineglass hit the floor before either of them could speak. The shatter rang out like a gunshot, the deep red liquid splattering across the pale rug in dramatic arcs. It bled outward beneath the table, soaking into the fibers like it belonged there. Mark didn't flinch. He couldn't. His hand still hovered midair, fork suspended inches from his plate, a chunk of pot roast skewered on the tines. His jaw clenched, then unclenched, then clenched again. Helen didn't blink. She reached calmly for her napkin, dabbing at the corner of her mouth, as if someone had merely asked her to pass the salt. Claire was the first to recover. "You came into our home just to humiliate us?" Helen didn't answer. Mark dropped his fork with a dull clang against the china. His voice dropped to a dangerous low. "You've gone senile." Helen stood slowly. "No, Mark. I've gone clear." Her chair scraped softly as she pushed it in. Every movement she made was deliberate, choreographed, like she had rehearsed it all the night before. Maybe she had. "You really think you can just rewrite your whole life and cut us out like we're nothing?" he said, voice rising. Helen smoothed the front of her cardigan. "Number, I didn't cut you out like you're nothing. I cut you out because you treated me like I was." Claire stared at the wine stain. "We opened our home to you." "No," Helen said, her tone flat. "You opened a seat at a table you already resented me for occupying." Mark stood now too, shoulders squared. "You'll regret this." Helen turned her eyes on him. Cool, level, unimpressed. "Number regret was thinking I had more time to fix who you became." He took a step closer. "You don't walk away from your family." "I didn't," she replied. "I walked back to myself." For a second it looked like he might say something else, but nothing came. Not anger, not apology, just silence. A choking, thick, electric silence that filled the space between them like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Claire folded her arms, lips pressed so tight they went colorless. Helen picked up her purse and slung it over her shoulder. She walked to the foyer, calm and unhurried, her heels tapping across the hardwood like punctuation marks. At the door, she paused and looked over her shoulder. "I didn't come here for your reaction," she said. "I came here for my freedom." And then she left. The door clicked shut behind her. Outside, the air was colder than expected for mid-April. A wind swept down the block, kicking up the last brittle leaves that winter hadn't quite finished off. Helen zipped her coat, tucked her scarf close, and began walking. Not toward her car, but just forward, down the sidewalk, letting her body lead. For the first time in years, her pace wasn't tentative. Her hands didn't shake. Her throat didn't tighten. The house behind her loomed silently in her periphery. She didn't look back. She kept walking. Back inside, Claire bent down with shaking hands to pick up the broken glass, muttering about the rug, the wine, the waste. Mark stood frozen at the table, staring at the untouched plate in front of him. He finally reached across the table and tore open the envelope she had left. Inside was the formal copy of the amended trust. His name, once printed on nearly every line, was nowhere. The only part that remained was the final page, her signature, Helen Ward in black ink, deliberate and unshaken. The first thing Helen did when she got home was take off her shoes. Not at the door, like polite habit dictated, but right in the middle of the living room, like she owned the air again. The house was still. Not silent in the aching way Mark's dining room had been, but warm and alive with the old comforts. The faint hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards settling, the soft tick of the wall clock that never quite kept perfect time. Everything familiar, everything hers. She set her purse down on the entry table and turned toward the kitchen, already reaching for the kettle when the phone on the wall rang. Not her cell phone, the landline, Only 4 people ever used it anymore. She stared at the caller ID. Mark. Helen didn't answer. She let it ring out. The machine kicked in. A pause, then his voice, louder than necessary, like he assumed she was hard of hearing. Mom, we need to talk. She stood by the stove, letting the kettle heat, her eyes fixed on the small red light blinking with each recorded second. You can't just pull something like this without thinking about the consequences, he continued, his tone straining for calm. You've been emotional, and Claire and I, well, we were surprised, that's all. But this doesn't feel like a decision made with a clear head. A pause. Breathing. You're not being fair after everything we've done. The message ended with a hard click. Helen reached for the phone. Pressed 7. Message erased. The kettle hissed behind her, just beginning to rumble. She turned to it, filled her favorite ceramic mug, the blue one with the chip on the rim, and dropped in a peppermint tea bag. She didn't stir, just stood there, letting the steam curl around her face. Her fingers wrapped around the mug slowly, warming her palms. The phone rang again. This time it was her cell phone, buzzing against the dining table with Ruth's name glowing on the screen. Helen answered on the 3rd ring. You okay? Ruth asked immediately. I've been staring at the clock like a lunatic since you left for that dinner. Helen smiled softly and sat down in her usual chair by the front window. I'm fine. How'd it go? Helen looked out the window. The sky had begun to spit snow, fat flakes drifting lazily down. It wouldn't stick. April snows rarely did, but it was still beautiful. He's rattled, Helen said, sipping her tea. That means it worked. It did. Ruth hesitated on the line, then let out a satisfied sigh. You sound different. I feel different. The words came out like a realization more than a statement. Helen glanced at the small basket of yarn beside her chair, pulled it closer, and began working the needles into motion. Automatic, familiar, comforting. What are you knitting now? Ruth asked. Not sure yet, Helen replied. Maybe a scarf, maybe just space. Ruth laughed, warm and proud. Well, knit your piece, Hel. You earned every stitch. They hung up soon after. No drama, no crisis, just quiet solidarity. Helen sat working her yarn as snow flurried against the windowpane in slow motion. The house, for all its age and creaks, felt anchored, not lonely, not empty, just full of the kind of silence that meant she was no longer shrinking to survive. The kettle hadn't even finished boiling when Helen returned from her walk and reached for the phone. She had been waiting for Thomas's call, and, just as he always did, he was precisely on time. His voice came through the speaker calm, unflappable, like the click of a lock sliding into place. Everything has been processed, Thomas said. I've confirmed the filing is sealed and officially registered with the county. The trust is executed, the previous will revoked. It's untouchable. Helen stood by the window, her eyes resting on the fading daylight outside. Pale gold light washed over the trees, now bare and rattling in the cool wind. Her hand rested lightly on the back of the kitchen chair. And if they try to contest? They won't get far, he said. The language is ironclad. We included every clause I use when I know the family's going to pitch a fit. Helen smiled faintly, despite herself. That's what this is, isn't it? A fit. Fits only come from people who feel entitled. Yours will be loud, but meaningless. There was a long pause. Helen watched 2 squirrels chase each other across the fence line behind the house. They ran fast, then stopped suddenly, frozen in place, as if caught remembering something too late. Thank you, she said quietly. Thomas responded with a gentle, matter-of-fact finality. You did the hard part. After she hung up, Helen boiled water, filled a thermos with black tea, and tucked her canvas shopping bag under her arm. She needed groceries and fresh air. At the market, everything moved with familiar rhythm. She walked the aisles with unhurried ease, selecting a few staples: brown eggs, old-fashioned oats, a head of red leaf lettuce, 2 navel oranges. She read labels slowly. She checked for soft spots on tomatoes. She let her world expand outward again, now that her center was no longer fragile. She had just turned onto the floral aisle when she felt the shift. It wasn't a sound. Not yet. It was presence. Helen looked up. Claire was standing at the edge of the freezer section, arms folded tightly across her chest, a pale gray coat thrown over what looked like a cocktail dress. Her makeup was sharp, sculpted for a party, not produce. She hadn't come here for bread or milk. She had come for Helen. They made eye contact, and Claire began walking toward her with purpose. Helen turned back to the shelf in front of her, studying 2 types of local honey. "You've been dodging Mark's calls," Claire said as she arrived beside her. Her voice was low and clipped, but her posture was taut, as if she was balancing on the edge of something dangerous. Helen remained still, took one of the jars, read the label again, and placed it gently into her basket. "You have to fix this," Claire said, the words louder now. "You don't know what you've started." Helen didn't respond. She pushed her cart forward, toward the next aisle. Claire followed. "This isn't a game, Helen. You may think you're teaching some grand lesson, but you're ruining lives. You are destabilizing everything: Mark's career, our finances, our future." Helen stopped her cart at the end of the aisle and turned just enough to meet Claire's eyes. Her voice, when it came, was even and low. "I'm not destabilizing anything. I'm refusing to fund people who treat me like I'm already gone." Claire's expression twisted slightly, the tight veneer of control beginning to slip. "You're bitter. That's all this is." "No," Helen said calmly. "I'm done." Claire stepped closer, and now the words came through her teeth. "Undo it. Fix this. Or else." Helen didn't flinch. "You'll have to be more specific than that." For a moment, Claire looked as if she might slap her, but instead, she scoffed, spun on her heel, and marched down the aisle without another word. Her heels clacked angrily on the polished tile until they were gone. Helen exhaled. Not relief, not fear, something closer to resolve. She reached the register and added a bouquet of tulips, bright yellow and pale pink, to her basket. As she paid, she hummed to herself softly, the tune half forgotten but warm in her throat. She didn't rush. She didn't look behind her. She walked to her car slowly, the flowers tucked in her arms, the air brisk but not biting. The second note came 3 days later. It wasn't tucked under the doormat this time. It was wedged into the slats of her wooden fence, folded over itself and soaked by the morning frost. Helen found it while refilling the bird feeder near the back gate. Her fingers, already chilled from the metal seed scoop, stiffened slightly as she pulled the paper loose. "You think this is over?" There was no signature. The handwriting was jagged, desperate, pressed too hard into the page, like someone had written it with their whole arm. She didn't need a name. She placed the note inside a sandwich bag, sealed it, and slid it between the pages of a manila folder that already contained the first. That afternoon, she brought the folder to Thomas. His office was dimmer than usual, late winter shadows cutting long across the floor, but Thomas remained unchanged. As she laid the folder gently on his desk, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose before even opening it. She watched him scan both notes in silence. When he looked up, there was no uncertainty in his expression. "This is harassment," he said. Helen nodded slowly. "I wanted it documented." "I'll add it to our case notes, but this isn't just a legal issue anymore," he said, carefully sliding the folder shut. "They're trying to rattle you." "It's not working." Thomas smiled just slightly. "Number, I can see that." Before either of them could speak again, a firm knock interrupted the quiet. The door opened a second later, and Ruth stepped inside, cheeks flushed from the cold, her coat still dusted with snowflakes. "I told her to file a report," Ruth said without preamble. "These people don't just get to leave trash on your property and walk away." Helen stood to greet her. "That's why we're here." Thomas gestured to the chair beside Helen. "Take a seat, Ms. Johnson. We were just discussing next steps." Ruth remained standing. "Helen, I love you, but you've been handling this with the patience of a nun. It's time they know this isn't going to scare you back into a corner." Helen gave a tired smile. "They already know. That's why they're escalating." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Do you want me to come with you to file the report?" "No," Helen said. "I'll do it alone, quietly." Ruth didn't like that answer. Helen could see it in the twitch of her jaw, but she didn't argue. Instead, she followed Helen out, waiting while she bundled up, then trailing beside her through the falling snow. The police station was clean and cold and impersonal. A young officer behind the desk took her statement with the kind of mechanical empathy reserved for paperwork, too soft to be urgent. He logged the details, photocopied the notes, and told her they would open an incident file. Helen didn't ask what would come of it. She already knew. It was nearly dusk when they stepped back outside. Ruth offered to drive her home, but Helen declined. She wanted the walk. The snow was soft and dry, piling up gently along the curbs, blanketing the streets in quiet. With each step, the crunch of her boots against the ice-covered sidewalks was steady and rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. There were no headlights behind her, no voices, just the sound of her own movement and the soft hush of snowflakes settling on her shoulders. The wind picked up near her block, lifting tiny spirals of powder from the street. Helen turned her face into it, eyes narrowed, and kept walking. There was no fear in her gait, no hesitation. When she arrived home, she hung her coat on the peg, removed her scarf with care, and made herself a cup of tea. The house smelled like lemon balm and dry oak and home. She felt strangely strong, not armored, just whole. Later that evening, Thomas called again. "I saw the copy of the report," he said, "and I meant what I said before. They can't touch the trust." "I know," Helen said, voice calm. "Legally, you're untouchable." Helen looked out the window, where the street lamps glowed against the snow-covered branches, casting soft golden shadows across her living room floor. "I believe you." The waiting room at the psychologist's office was quiet, warm, and smelled faintly of chamomile tea and photocopy paper. Helen sat in the corner chair, closest to the window, and watched the snowmelt drip steadily from the edge of the roof, each droplet racing the others to the sidewalk below. She had brought nothing to distract herself, no knitting, no book, no phone in hand. She didn't need a distraction. She needed to be seen, as she truly was, whole, sharp, entirely present. A door opened down the hall, and a woman in her mid-50s with thoughtful eyes and silver-threaded hair stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Helen Ward?" Helen rose, calm and steady. "That's me." They walked together down a narrow hallway lined with abstract prints and softly humming light fixtures. The office they entered was small, but inviting, sun spilling in through half-closed blinds, 2 upholstered chairs arranged in quiet symmetry, and a desk pushed against the back wall with carefully stacked files. The psychologist gestured to the chair nearest the window. "Make yourself comfortable, I'm Dr. Keating." Helen sat, her posture tall but unforced. "Thank you." Dr. Keating settled into the opposite chair, opened a folder, and glanced down at her notes. "We're here for a competency evaluation related to a probate claim filed by your son. You're aware?" "I am." "Are you aware that he's alleged cognitive decline due to age, isolation, and emotional instability?" Helen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes." "I read the petition." Dr. Keating nodded, then looked up fully for the first time. "Well, let's begin, shall we?" What followed wasn't difficult. Not for Helen. She answered each question clearly, directly, stating the date, the time, the president's name, her full address. She remembered a series of words and repeated them backward without faltering. She identified shapes, counted by sevens, and named every U.S. state that touched the Great Lakes. Dr. Keating tried to trip her up with abstract questions. "If you found a stamped letter on the sidewalk, what would you do?" "Put it in a mailbox," Helen replied. "Unless it was wet. Then I'd take it home to dry first." "What does the saying, 'don't cry over spilled milk,' mean to you?" "That regrets don't rewrite outcomes." Keating smiled faintly. "Very good." They moved to a short discussion about Helen's medical history, her daily routines, her financial decisions, how she paid bills, how she managed medication, how often she drove. At one point, Dr. Keating paused and asked, "Why do you think your son filed this?" Helen answered without blinking, "Because control is louder than love in his world." The room was quiet after that. There was a long pause. Helen watched 2 squirrels chase each other across the fence line behind the house. They ran fast, then stopped suddenly, frozen in place, as if caught remembering something too late. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thomas responded with a gentle, matter-of-fact finality. You did the hard part. After she hung up, Helen boiled water, filled a thermos with black tea, and tucked her canvas shopping bag under her arm. She needed groceries and fresh air. At the market, everything moved with familiar rhythm. She walked the aisles with unhurried ease, selecting a few staples: brown eggs, old-fashioned oats, a head of red leaf lettuce, 2 navel oranges. She read labels slowly. She checked for soft spots on tomatoes. She let her world expand outward again, now that her center was no longer fragile. She had just turned onto the floral aisle when she felt the shift. It wasn't a sound. Not yet. It was presence. Helen looked up. Claire was standing at the edge of the freezer section, arms folded tightly across her chest, a pale gray coat thrown over what looked like a cocktail dress. Her makeup was sharp, sculpted for a party, not produce. She hadn't come here for bread or milk. She had come for Helen. They made eye contact, and Claire began walking toward her with purpose. Helen turned back to the shelf in front of her, studying 2 types of local honey. You've been dodging Mark's calls, Claire said as she arrived beside her. Her voice was low and clipped, but her posture was taut, as if she was balancing on the edge of something dangerous. Helen remained still, took one of the jars, read the label again, and placed it gently into her basket. You have to fix this, Claire said, the words louder now. You don't know what you've started. Helen didn't respond. She pushed her cart forward, toward the next aisle. Claire followed. This isn't a game, Helen. You may think you're teaching some grand lesson, but you're ruining lives. You are destabilizing everything: Mark's career, our finances, our future. Helen stopped her cart at the end of the aisle and turned just enough to meet Claire's eyes. Her voice, when it came, was even and low. I'm not destabilizing anything. I'm refusing to fund people who treat me like I'm already gone. Claire's expression twisted slightly, the tight veneer of control beginning to slip. You're bitter. That's all this is. No, Helen said calmly. I'm done. Claire stepped closer, and now the words came through her teeth. Undo it. Fix this. Or else. Helen didn't flinch. You'll have to be more specific than that. For a moment, Claire looked as if she might slap her, but instead, she scoffed, spun on her heel, and marched down the aisle without another word. Her heels clacked angrily on the polished tile until they were gone. Helen exhaled. Not relief, not fear, something closer to resolve. She reached the register and added a bouquet of tulips, bright yellow and pale pink, to her basket. As she paid, she hummed to herself softly, the tune half forgotten but warm in her throat. She didn't rush. She didn't look behind her. She walked to her car slowly, the flowers tucked in her arms, the air brisk but not biting. The second note came 3 days later. It wasn't tucked under the doormat this time. It was wedged into the slats of her wooden fence, folded over itself and soaked by the morning frost. Helen found it while refilling the bird feeder near the back gate. Her fingers, already chilled from the metal seed scoop, stiffened slightly as she pulled the paper loose. You think this is over? There was no signature. The handwriting was jagged, desperate, pressed too hard into the page, like someone had written it with their whole arm. She didn't need a name. She placed the note inside a sandwich bag, sealed it, and slid it between the pages of a manila folder that already contained the first. That afternoon, she brought the folder to Thomas. His office was dimmer than usual, late winter shadows cutting long across the floor, but Thomas remained unchanged. As she laid the folder gently on his desk, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose before even opening it. She watched him scan both notes in silence. When he looked up, there was no uncertainty in his expression. This is harassment, he said. Helen nodded slowly. I wanted it documented. I'll add it to our case notes, but this isn't just a legal issue anymore, he said, carefully sliding the folder shut. They're trying to rattle you. It's not working. Thomas smiled just slightly. Number, I can see that. Before either of them could speak again, a firm knock interrupted the quiet. The door opened a second later, and Ruth stepped inside, cheeks flushed from the cold, her coat still dusted with snowflakes. I told her to file a report, Ruth said without preamble. These people don't just get to leave trash on your property and walk away. Helen stood to greet her. "That's why we're here." Thomas gestured to the chair beside Helen. "Take a seat, Ms. Johnson. We were just discussing next steps." Ruth remained standing. "Helen, I love you, but you've been handling this with the patience of a nun. It's time they know this isn't going to scare you back into a corner." Helen gave a tired smile. "They already know. That's why they're escalating." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Do you want me to come with you to file the report?" "No," Helen said. "I'll do it alone, quietly." Ruth didn't like that answer. Helen could see it in the twitch of her jaw, but she didn't argue. Instead, she followed Helen out, waiting while she bundled up, then trailing beside her through the falling snow. The police station was clean and cold and impersonal. A young officer behind the desk took her statement with the kind of mechanical empathy reserved for paperwork, too soft to be urgent. He logged the details, photocopied the notes, and told her they would open an incident file. Helen didn't ask what would come of it. She already knew. It was nearly dusk when they stepped back outside. Ruth offered to drive her home, but Helen declined. She wanted the walk. The snow was soft and dry, piling up gently along the curbs, blanketing the streets in quiet. With each step, the crunch of her boots against the ice-covered sidewalks was steady and rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. There were no headlights behind her, no voices. Just the sound of her own movement and the soft hush of snowflakes settling on her shoulders. The wind picked up near her block, lifting tiny spirals of powder from the street. Helen turned her face into it, eyes narrowed, and kept walking. There was no fear in her gait, no hesitation. When she arrived home, she hung her coat on the peg, removed her scarf with care, and made herself a cup of tea. The house smelled like lemon balm and dry oak and home. She felt strangely strong, not armored, just whole. Later that evening, Thomas called again. "I saw the copy of the report," he said, "and I meant what I said before. They can't touch the trust." "I know," Helen said, voice calm. "Legally, you're untouchable." Helen looked out the window, where the street lamps glowed against the snow-covered branches, casting soft golden shadows across her living room floor. "I believe you." The waiting room at the psychologist's office was quiet, warm, and smelled faintly of chamomile tea and photocopy paper. Helen sat in the corner chair, closest to the window, and watched the snowmelt drip steadily from the edge of the roof, each droplet racing the others to the sidewalk below. She had brought nothing to distract herself, no knitting, no book, no phone in hand. She didn't need a distraction. She needed to be seen, as she truly was, whole, sharp, entirely present. A door opened down the hall, and a woman in her mid-50s with thoughtful eyes and silver-threaded hair stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Helen Ward?" Helen rose, calm and steady. "That's me." They walked together down a narrow hallway lined with abstract prints and softly humming light fixtures. The office they entered was small, but inviting, sun spilling in through half-closed blinds, 2 upholstered chairs arranged in quiet symmetry, and a desk pushed against the back wall with carefully stacked files. The psychologist gestured to the chair nearest the window. "Make yourself comfortable, I'm Dr. Keating." Helen sat, her posture tall but unforced. "Thank you." Dr. Keating settled into the opposite chair, opened a folder, and glanced down at her notes. "We're here for a competency evaluation related to a probate claim filed by your son. You're aware?" "I am." "Are you aware that he's alleged cognitive decline due to age, isolation, and emotional instability?" Helen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes. I read the petition." Dr. Keating nodded, then looked up fully for the first time. "Well, let's begin, shall we?" What followed wasn't difficult. Not for Helen. She answered each question clearly, directly, stating the date, the time, the president's name, her full address. She remembered a series of words and repeated them backward without faltering. She identified shapes, counted by sevens, and named every U.S. state that touched the Great Lakes. Dr. Keating tried to trip her up with abstract questions. "If you found a stamped letter on the sidewalk, what would you do?" "Put it in a mailbox," Helen replied. "Unless it was wet. Then I'd take it home to dry first." "What does the saying, 'Don't cry over spilled milk,' mean to you?" "That regrets don't rewrite outcomes." Keating smiled faintly. Very good. They moved to a short discussion about Helen's medical history, her daily routines, her financial decisions, how she paid bills, how she managed medication, how often she drove. At one point, Dr. Keating paused and asked, "Why do you think your son filed this?" Helen answered without blinking, "Because control is louder than love in his world." The room was quiet after that. When the evaluation ended, Dr. Keating stood and extended her hand. "You're remarkably articulate, Mrs. Ward. You've passed every standard measure." Helen shook her hand, firm and polite. "I'm not surprised." The hearing took place 1 week later in a modest probate courtroom with high ceilings and unforgiving acoustics. The judge was a woman in her 60s with short gray curls and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings. Helen sat at the front beside Thomas, who wore a navy suit and brought 4 neatly labeled binders. Mark sat on the other side of the room, arms crossed, flanked by a lawyer who looked increasingly uncomfortable with each passing minute. Claire wasn't present. Helen didn't speak during the proceeding. She didn't need to. Dr. Keating's report did all the talking. Cognitively sound, emotionally stable, fully capable of managing her affairs. The judge asked one question before ruling, "Mrs. Ward, are you aware of the decisions you've made regarding your estate?" "I am." "Do you believe they were made under undue influence?" "I made them with full awareness and full intent." The judge looked at Thomas, then back at Helen. "Then there's no basis for this petition." She struck her gavel once, sharply. "Dismissed." Outside the courthouse, snow had started again, not heavy but steady. Helen stood on the top step, her coat open, chin lifted into the falling flakes. Ruth emerged from the crowd and slipped an arm around her. "Well?" she asked, grinning. Helen exhaled. "He failed." Ruth squeezed her arm. "Of course he did." The first time Helen noticed the car, it was parked just beyond the stop sign at the end of the street. Idling, headlights off, engine purring like a restless animal. A sleek silver SUV, newer than anything owned on her block, with tinted windows that hid more than just the afternoon sun. She saw it from the front window as she poured herself a second cup of tea, and though she couldn't see the driver's face, something in the stillness gave it away. She didn't flinch. She simply lowered the blinds. The next morning, it was there again. Different time, same car, same posture of watching without daring to knock. By the third day, her neighbor, Mrs. Falco, from 3 doors down, rang the bell mid-afternoon. "I hate to intrude," she said, bundled in her plaid wool coat and sensible snow boots. "But is everything all right, Helen?" "Of course," Helen replied. "Why do you ask?" "Well," Mrs. Falco hesitated, "that SUV's been sitting outside your house every other day, sometimes twice. A man with dark hair, just sits there, doesn't get out. The Hendersons said he was there past midnight on Tuesday." Helen gave a polite, measured smile. "It's being handled." That night, she called a locksmith. By the weekend, every entry point had a new deadbolt. 2 motion-sensitive floodlights were installed above the garage and back porch. She purchased a small set of cameras, easy to install, easy to monitor from her phone, and set them up herself with the manual spread across the dining table like a war map. She read each page twice, tested every angle. When Ruth came over and saw the new keypad locks, she said nothing at first. But later, as they sat at the kitchen table with mugs of cinnamon tea and a plate of molasses cookies cooling between them, she spoke up. "You shouldn't be alone." Helen nodded once, "Then stay." So Ruth did. For the next 3 nights, she slept on the pullout in the den, insisting she liked the old ticking of the wall clock and the smell of cedar in the air. They stayed up late watching black and white films Helen had loved since college. They argued about whether Cary Grant or Jimmy Stewart had the better comedic timing. They drank tea until it was almost morning, and Helen, who hadn't baked in weeks, moved like muscle memory was returning to her hands. Sugar cookies on Friday, banana bread on Saturday. On Sunday afternoon, while Ruth helped fold laundry, Helen stood at the counter rolling out dough for her favorite almond shortbread. The oven filled the house with warmth, the kind that smelled like holidays and patience and belonging. "I've been thinking," Helen said as she dusted the counter with flour, "about how it never really felt like my house when Mark was there. Not truly." Ruth looked up. "Because he made you feel like a guest?" Because I acted like one. She pulled the fresh trust papers from a drawer in the kitchen and brought them into the living room. She had them reprinted, clean copies on thick, archival-grade paper. Every page had her signature, notarized and dated. No ambiguity, no loopholes. She placed the folder in the fireproof safe beneath her bedroom floorboards, beside the deed, her passport, and a photo of her and her husband taken on their first anniversary. The safe clicked shut, secure and quiet. Later that night, Helen stood at the window again. The street was quiet. No SUV, no headlights. But she didn't let herself relax fully. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she knew what a person could become when they were denied the thing they believed they deserved. She checked her locks, twice. The sound came just after 3 a.m., a single sharp crack, followed by the unmistakable patter of shattered glass hitting hardwood. Helen didn't bolt upright. She opened her eyes slowly, as if she had been expecting it. She lay still for a moment, listening. The house around her was hushed except for the occasional groan of old pipes and the gentle hum of the furnace. Then came the cold whisper of wind sliding through someplace it didn't belong. A window had been broken. She rose, pulled on her robe, and reached for the flashlight on her nightstand. She didn't turn it on right away. There was enough moonlight spilling in through the hallway to guide her down the stairs. The hardwood was cool under her bare feet, but she moved calmly, her breath steady. In the dining room, the side window above the buffet table had been shattered inward. A jagged hole gaped through the middle of the pane, its sharp edges catching the moonlight like teeth. Glass littered the rug and hardwood in scattered constellations. Helen turned on the flashlight, traced the beam slowly across the room, and saw what had come through. A brick, wrapped in duct tape. She didn't touch it. She turned off the flashlight, walked back upstairs, and called the police. By the time the two officers arrived, the sun had not yet risen, but the sky had begun to lighten, the earliest suggestion of morning creeping along the horizon. Ruth was already downstairs, standing at the edge of the broken window in her wool socks and flannel pajama pants. Helen had made tea. She sat at the kitchen table, one leg crossed over the other, her mug steaming quietly between her hands. The younger officer crouched to examine the brick while his partner jotted notes on a narrow pad. He glanced at Ruth, then at Helen. Any idea who might have done this? Helen didn't look away from her tea. Yes. Someone you're in a legal dispute with? Yes. Do you feel unsafe at this time? No, she said calmly. I've already taken precautions. The younger officer rose and gestured to the brick. No note. No fingerprintable surface with this much tape, but we'll log it, file the damage. Patrol will keep an eye on the street for a few days. His partner cleared his throat, tapping his pen against the pad. You're sure you don't want to press charges? Helen took a sip of tea, then set the mug down gently. Not yet. Ruth's head snapped toward her. But Helen raised a hand not as a silencing gesture, but one of steady, measured restraint. He's unraveling on his own, she said. I'd rather let him keep proving it. The officer's pen paused, hovering above the page, then scribbled something down. We'll file it under criminal mischief and intimidation, but I respect your decision. If anything escalates, call immediately. We will, Ruth said, stepping forward, arms folded tightly. And next time, I will press charges. The officers thanked them and left. The front door closed behind them with a soft click, and the house fell back into quiet again. Helen stood, poured the rest of her tea into the sink, and began sweeping up the glass as if it were just another chore in the rhythm of her day. Ruth helped without asking. They worked side by side in the early light, neither saying much until the last shard had been collected and dropped into a brown paper bag for disposal. I don't know how you're so calm, Ruth said finally, handing her a dustpan. Helen wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and glanced out the broken window, where a thin frost still clung to the outside frame. Because this house belongs to me, she said, and I'm not leaving. Ruth gave a slow, respectful nod. Helen opened the cabinet, pulled out her vacuum's extension hose, and began working glass from between the cracks in the baseboard. The courtroom was smaller than Helen expected. Not the grand oak-paneled chamber she had imagined, but a rectangular room tucked behind a long hallway on the third floor of the downtown courthouse. Pale fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The linoleum floors had lost their shine decades ago. It felt more like a waiting room for judgment than judgment itself. Helen sat in the second row, just behind Thomas and to the left of Ruth, who hadn't said much all morning. She didn't need to. They both knew why they were there. Up ahead, at the long table marked Debtor, Mark sat beside a man in a rumpled charcoal suit, thumbing nervously through a stack of documents. His expression was strained, eyes darting, jaw tight, the faintest sheen of sweat gathering at his temple. He looked smaller than Helen remembered, not in stature but in presence. The version of him who once called her "old lady" at the dinner table had vanished, replaced by a man drowning behind his own name. Claire sat behind him, arms crossed, legs angled away from the bench as if she could physically distance herself from the proceedings. She wore dark glasses despite the overhead lights, but Helen didn't need to see her eyes to read the resentment curdled in every inch of her posture. The hearing began. The clerk called the case number. The judge, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s with a steel-gray bun and no visible patience, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file in front of her. "Mark William Ward, filing under Chapter 13, she read aloud. "Petitioner seeks court approval to restructure over $420,000 in personal debt, including credit cards, a second mortgage, and multiple lines of unsecured credit." Helen didn't flinch. She already knew the number. Mark's attorney rose, beginning the defense with a practiced tone that had likely worked in dozens of other courtrooms. "My client has experienced significant financial strain due to unforeseen legal fees and familial disruption. He is requesting leniency and time to liquidate assets in a way that maintains some—" "Mr. Vance," the judge interrupted without lifting her head, "save the theater. I've read the file. Extensively." The lawyer sat back down with a barely contained sigh. Mark shifted in his chair, leaning forward. "Your Honor, I'm willing to work with my creditors. I've already sold off the boat and the cabin. I just need time to—" "You were living beyond your means long before your mother's estate was ever removed from your equation," the judge cut in, "and based on these records, you've made no payments toward principal debt in over 9 months. You've mismanaged 3 refinances, defaulted on your business line of credit, and misrepresented your projected income in 2 separate bank statements." The room held its breath. Claire uncrossed her arms, sat up straighter, then slumped again. Helen folded her hands in her lap. Her expression didn't change. The judge continued, eyes sharp. "You've filed for relief, Mr. Ward, but there's limited equity left to protect. And according to your financial disclosure, the only remaining asset with enough value to satisfy your repayment obligations is your primary residence." Mark looked up sharply. "But it's our home. My kids grew up there." The judge's voice didn't soften. "It's also collateral, and you signed those agreements freely. That house is not exempt from liquidation." Claire leaned forward in her seat, whispering something in Mark's ear. His face went pale. For the first time, his mouth didn't move. In the gallery, Ruth leaned over slightly and whispered to Helen, voice low and unsmiling, "Poetic justice." Helen didn't nod. She didn't smirk. She just kept watching. The judge tapped her pen once on the file. "Effective immediately, this court approves the motion to vacate. The home will be listed within 30 days to satisfy outstanding debt. Debtor is to surrender the property no later than May 1st. The gavel came down with one decisive, echoing crack. "Next case." As the crowd began to shift and shuffle out, Mark remained seated. Claire had already stood, adjusting her coat with sharp, angry movements, but he stayed still, staring straight ahead like someone watching their reflection in a breaking mirror. Thomas turned to Helen and gave a short nod. He didn't need to speak. They rose and filed out quietly, Ruth beside her, the click of their shoes against the courthouse floor, steady and unhurried. Outside, the wind had picked up. The snow had stopped, but the chill remained, threading its way through Helen's coat and down to her wrists. She didn't button up. She didn't need to. Her breath fogged in the air, soft and slow. The moving van came at 8:42 a.m., right on schedule. The sheriff's cruiser had arrived 10 minutes earlier. Claire was already yelling when the first box came out the front door. Helen didn't watch from her window. She didn't need to. Mrs. Falco had called half an hour earlier, breathless with indignation, to report that a deputy with a clipboard and a very red face had been standing at Mark's porch while movers loitered near the driveway. The neighborhood dogs were barking. At least one drone was circling overhead. "Mark's on the lawn pacing," Mrs. Falco had whispered. "But Claire? Claire's in full meltdown." Helen thanked her, hung up and poured herself another cup of tea. Outside, snow flurried down in light, slow motion. Not a storm, just a hush falling over everything. The kind of snowfall that padded sound and softened harsh lines. Inside her bungalow, the fireplace crackled steadily, a wool blanket draped over Helen's knees. She stirred her tea with a silver spoon, one circle at a time, then set it down and leaned back in her chair. The book in her lap had been open for 10 minutes. She hadn't turned the page. She didn't need to. Across town, her son was being ordered off his own property, escorted by uniformed officers, watched by neighbors who remembered when he bragged about lake vacations and quarterly bonuses. Claire was shouting about family betrayal and manipulative old women, while a mover rolled a Peloton bike down the walkway with the casual efficiency of someone used to marital fallout. Helen closed her book finally. The fire warmed the sides of her legs through the wool, and she let it. An hour later, Ruth arrived with a fresh cherry pie. "No frozen crust this time," she declared proudly, wiping snow from her coat sleeves as she stepped inside. "This one's the real deal. Handmade lattice top and everything." Helen took the box, unwrapped it slowly, and peered down at the deep crimson filling. "It looks like revenge." Ruth smirked. "It tastes like peace." They ate slices in the living room, plates balanced on their laps, legs curled under them like girls at a sleepover. The fire had settled into a mellow burn, glowing more than crackling now. "I saw a clip," Ruth said between bites. "Some local reporter caught Claire yelling at a deputy, claimed she was being evicted by a senior citizen cult." Helen laughed, not bitterly but lightly, like something had cracked open in her chest and let the air move through again. "Sounds like she's adjusting well." Ruth raised her fork. "To you, Helen Ward, the quietest wrecking ball I've ever met." They toasted with pie. That evening, Thomas called. Helen had just returned from shoveling a light dusting off her walkway, cheeks flushed, scarf still looped loosely around her neck. She answered on the second ring. "Thomas," she said, pulling her cardigan tighter. "Just wanted you to hear it from me," he said, voice clear and calm as ever. "Everything's finalized on the trust. We added the recent attempts to contest and the police reports to your security file. The system's locked tighter than ever." Helen let out a slow breath. "So that's it?" "That's it," he confirmed. "Short of you changing your mind, your estate is legally impenetrable. Not even a whisper of a loophole left." "Good," Helen said. There was a pause, gentle, not strained. "I hope you'll let this be over now," Thomas added. "You've done everything right. It's okay to just live again." Helen looked toward the window. Outside, the snow had started again, this time more insistently. Fat flakes spiraled under the glow of the porch light. Her lawn was already blanketed, untouched and pure. "I plan to," she said. "Call if anything changes." "I will." She hung up and stood for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. No distant engines, no flicker of headlights, no sharp edge of threat hiding between her walls. She walked back into the living room, tucked her blanket around her lap again, and stared into the fire until her eyes stopped searching. In her bungalow, small, worn, entirely hers, Helen felt something rare and complete. Not victory, not vindication. Equilibrium. The library smelled like paper and warmth and possibility. Its old radiators hissed gently beneath wide windows, and strings of white lights were draped between the ceiling beams like constellations. The room glowed, not from grandeur, but from attention. Each table had been pushed back to make space for folding chairs and cocoa dispensers. Red construction paper hearts adorned the walls, handmade by small hands with blunt scissors and too much glue. Helen sat in the second row, wearing a navy coat with silver buttons she hadn't worn in years. Ruth was beside her, a string of pearls at her throat and a smile she didn't try to hide. At the front of the room, a girl no older than 7 stood behind a short podium, reading a book titled The Snowy Day. She stumbled once, on crunch, but recovered quickly, eyes scanning the page with the quiet confidence of someone who knows they're being cheered for, even in silence. Helen's heart beat slowly, steadily. "She's reading from the new winter collection," Ruth whispered, leaning in just enough to brush her shoulder. "Your money made that shelf." Helen nodded, watching as the girl turned another page, hands steady beneath the paper. When the reading ended, the room applauded, not thunderously, but kindly. Parents, board members, teachers, and children, dozens of them, scattered across the floor with books open on their laps and crumbs of chocolate cookie on their sleeves. The library director took the podium next. Her name was Dr. Anita Benson, a brisk woman with kind eyes and an agenda clipboard that never left her side. Tonight, she was smiling broadly, her voice soft but clear. "We often talk about legacy," Dr. Benson began, "but it's rare we get to witness it in real time. Thanks to the generous endowment from Mrs. Helen Ward, our youth literacy program is not only preserved, but expanded. We've added over 300 titles, restored a reading annex that was once slated for demolition, and created after-school support for students who need it most." Helen glanced down at her lap. Her hands were folded gently, the fingers no longer stiff from anger or fear. She had never liked applause, not for herself, but tonight it felt like something else. Not a spotlight, just daylight. Dr. Benson continued, "Helen didn't ask to speak tonight, but we're going to clap for her anyway." Laughter trickled across the crowd, then applause, not polite this time, but full and warm. Helen smiled. Ruth stood and clapped a little harder. She stayed seated. She didn't need to rise to be seen. The walk home was long, but Helen took it anyway. The fundraiser had ended just after 7, and the air outside had turned crisp enough to nip at her cheeks. She walked slowly, mittens tucked in her coat pocket, scarf wrapped loose around her neck. The library glowed behind her, its windows soft with lamplight and laughter. The snow under her boots wasn't fresh, but it was clean. That mattered more. Ruth had offered her a ride, twice, but Helen had shaken her head. "I want the air," she'd said, "and the quiet." So she walked, past shuttered shops, past empty porches and flickering porch lights. Her feet carried her forward with a rhythm that belonged only to her. A group of teenagers passed by on the opposite sidewalk, laughing, their breath blooming in clouds. One of them carried a library tote with a corner of a picture book sticking out. She smiled to herself. By the time she reached her block, the world had settled into a hush again. Her bungalow stood waiting at the end of the street, small, warm, defiant. A porch light still on, a wreath still hanging, slightly crooked from last month's wind. Helen climbed the steps without hurrying. Inside, she made tea. Peppermint again. She sat by the fire, the logs already smoldering down to embers. No drone of televisions, no pounding footsteps upstairs, no tension in the walls, just her, and the quiet, and the hum of a house finally safe. She sipped, watched the flames settle. Then softly, to no one at all, she said, "He pushed my plate away, but I pushed him out of everything that mattered."